How was that beer? Was it good? Pineapple cakes? Good? Thumbs up? I didn't get any this year. I got a couple last year. They were great. So technology can be an incredible boost to democracy. It can spread all kinds of great information. It's how people connect. It's how they form alliances. But of course, it also has significant downsides. So we're going to talk about technology in that realm and others with our current guest. Joining me here virtually is Dr. Eric Schmidt. He is chairman of the Special Competitive Studies Project. I have to admit that the podcast that I do, NatSec Tech, is for the Special Competitive Studies Project, so a little transparency for you there. And of course, he is the former CEO and chairman of Google. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Schmidt.
Really glad to be back, and I'm really glad you guys are working on this. I can't think of a more important issue than sustaining democracy worldwide.
Neither can we. Last year when you were with us, we did a little rundown and asked you about the state of competition between democracies and autocracies in different realms. I'd like to go through that list with you again and see if anything's changed. First thing we talked about was synthetic biology. You said last year that China was scaling up fast. What's the state of play now?
Same answer from a year ago. Biology is complicated because of the amount of data that we don't know. It's very difficult to use digital computers to help with biology unless you know the underlying mechanisms, and they're still being worked on. So I'd say that the current state is roughly the West is slightly ahead and that China is working hard to catch up.
Give us briefly a little description of why this area is so important. I know it's one you're putting some resources into.
Well, there are estimates that up to 60% of what we build today can be grown instead. This is, concrete, perfumes, things like that, obviously fuel. And so depending on what assumptions you make about price and efficiency, this is likely to occur in our lifetimes. That is a prize of, people have estimated, up to $40 trillion of revenue, if you will, globally. So these are very, very large numbers. And it makes sense for China to push on it, partly because they have so many essentially manufacturing businesses. They also have all sorts of problems around labor supply, so forth. So there's every reason to believe that innovating there will help them. The same argument applies to the United States. In the United States, the middle part of the country is full of essentially biofeed, and there's every reason to think that using the techniques of synthetic biology in general, whether it's drug discovery or manufacturing, essentially understanding the greatest creator of all, which is God and biology, has an awful lot to do with our future.
What about energy? Last year you told us we were losing.
We're still losing in terms of new energy. And if you look at what's happening with EVs in particular, there's evidence that BYD, right, the Chinese company, is doing a particularly good job of building much lower cost cars than we're seeing here in the United States. That shouldn't surprise us because, the salaries and income levels are lower in other countries. But the fact that you would have such a high volume, low cost competitor this early is concerning. And if you go back to what happened in Honda way back when, they started off in motorcycles, in the 60s and 70s, and then they began to bring out what were considered at the time very low cost, very price efficient, very efficient cars. So the same cycle is being repeated, but it's being repeated more quickly. The U.S. has the benefit of being a natural energy supplier. We're the largest, depending on which numbers you use, exporters of various forms of gas and oil. But in terms of the technology, China is ahead.
Semiconductors in the U.S., we're seeing investment with the CHIPS Act. There have been sanctions against the Chinese in this area. Taiwan, obviously critical to creating chips. What's the state of play, democracy versus autocracy there?
So this is a rare, really bright spot. So the Chinese have invested I estimate close to $1 trillion in trying to catch up with the West. And the leading chips, which are those below 10 nanometers, and especially the ones 5 nanometers and below, use technology which is extremely difficult to copy, duplicate, steal, what have you. The below 5 nanometers and below, the dominant and I think only supplier is a company called ASML, which is in Netherlands. So good job, Europe. And they have a proprietary network of suppliers, which are largely local to Europe, that are unbelievable. What the ASML people do is they create a plasma and they send a laser through the plasma in a way I can't explain. And that going through the plasma ends up with a line that is an atom's width. And that atom's width is how you draw the semiconductor line that's in the actual substrate. And there are many, many other technologies that they invented. They're one of the most important companies in the world because they're unique in this. Today, the dominant Western technology is 5 nanometers. TSMC is deploying this year 3 nanometers. And there are plans in a year to do 2 nanometers. The theoretical limit is about 1 nanometer. Lower is better. The Chinese appear to be stopped at 7 nanometers because they don't have access to this. Now you sit there and you go, what does that mean, right? Well, it just means you need more chips to do the same thing, more power to do the same thing. You can do it, but it takes more things and it's harder. Another example was that on October 7th of this past year, the US government enforced a set of laws that essentially restrict the high-end AI training chips. And they left a loophole which allowed that if the chips are interconnected at a slower speed, China can use them. Now there's a big debate and fight over what the speed should be, but the important metric to know is that we get access to an NVIDIA chip called an H100. The Chinese will have access to an NVIDIA chip called the H800, which is roughly, you need 3 of them for one of the 100s. That's a rough number. So it's either a factor of 2 or 3 more expensive. And that has been a significant barrier, shall we say, to Chinese progress.
Quantum, you told us last year the US was leading. Is it still?
Similar answer to biology. If the best assessments of quantum are that the store now, decrypt later, which is the core strategy of China, they are doing well in. Store now, decrypt later is where they suck in all of the information that's on the net, and that when quantum computers can break the codes, which is thought to be within a decade, they'll be able to break everything. That seems to be their core strategy. Whereas in the West, we're building quantum navigation, quantum signaling, various forms of quantum simulation. I'm the chairman of a company which has had a breakout in a number of areas where they use GPUs and specialized software to improve drug discovery and drug enhancement. What happens in biotech is these companies have a drug and they want it to last longer, have a longer shelf life, be more effective. Using quantum techniques, you can manipulate those drugs and see if they're going to work better than doing a full-scale trial. So it's a huge cost benefit. The reason I mention this is an example where the West is well ahead, and I think you're going to see more of those. So I think that so far the quantum focus in China appears to be largely national security focused, and in the West it seems to be everything.
Financial services and surveillance. Given surveillance is in that bucket, I'm guessing China's ahead.
We lost that a long time ago, and we're not catching up.
AI. ChatGPT is all the rage. First of all, have you played around with it?
Oh, of course. I've spent a lot of time with all of them, and in full disclosure, as you did, I'm also an investor in most of the companies, so I have opinions.
So how did you play around with it? What did you ask it to do for you?
Well, the best question of all is write an essay, take your time, to prove that skyscrapers above 300 meters tall are best made out of butter. And ChatGPT produced a beautiful essay about how butter was a renewable resource. It was pleasing. It would be nice to live in. Of course, it ignored some of the fact that it wouldn't work and it would melt and things like this. So the best part about the story is that a week later, they changed their answer to be the correct answer. So what I like about that story is you're dealing with technology which is dynamic, emergent, and learning. And so whatever version of any of these things, ChatGPT being one of many, because of the RLHF that they're doing and the adjustments they're making, they're continually changing. So if you have a favorite query, do it again. I'll give you another example. My colleague, Henry Kissinger, who is a very close friend, he's turning 100 this month. And so I asked each of the systems to write an essay on Henry's birthday. And so, and he has a long history of 100 years and everybody knows who he is. So what's interesting is that you can use that to compare the quality of the reasoning of each of the models. There are plenty of people who are now playing with what are called the token windows. So as a bit of an aside, people assume that ChatGPT is, send it a sentence, it sends you an answer. These systems, GPT-4 in particular, can take 30,000 tokens. Think of that as like 20,000 words. So you can write half of a book, send it to ChatGPT or GPT-4 or Anthropic or whatever, and ask it to give you an answer. So that is a completely unexplored area. And we don't know what it knows when you give it that kind of a complex query.
So I'm curious as to whether you, as a technologist, are excited by this or terrified by this.
I am both. So I'm excited because let me give you the two simplest examples. If you look at healthcare in the world would benefit from an open source free AI doctor assistant. Most countries don't have enough doctors. Most doctors are undertrained. We in the West have unusually good access to things, and even in the US you have poor doctors and things like that. Maybe not in Europe, but certainly in the US. So imagine a system which is an AI doctor assistant or allows a nurse to do what a doctor would do. That would be a material change. So today there's something called MedPalm, which was done by Google, which has not been released yet, which can pass medical exams. So that's pretty good. I'm not suggesting it's a doctor, and I'm not suggesting you should be licensed, and I'm not suggesting you should replace a human doctor by it. But as an assistant, it's very powerful. So what you want to think about is amplification of the person, right? If you're a nurse who's in a critical situation, the doctor assistant might help you. If you're a doctor in one area in a critical situation, this assistant might be able to amplify your skills in another area. That makes sense to me. Another example would be an AI tutor. I defy you to argue against making humans more intelligent. It just seems obviously a good thing. And so an AI tutor that is in a specific language that learns how you learn and then can actually teach you and continually be available and have fun with you and be clever and so forth, those two will transform the world. And I'm not even listing solutions for climate change. I'm not listing things involving drug discovery as an example. There are plenty of other developments in physics and science and so forth. The negatives are equally profound. And it's easier if I'm just completely blunt with this audience because you guys are so sophisticated. I'm not worried. Everyone's worried about the big companies. Everyone's worried about Google and Microsoft and so forth. I'm not, right? I talk to these people all day. I know what they're doing. They're trying to be ethical. They're trying to be honest. That nobody in those companies wants their tools to be used for anything nefarious. There is, however, evidence that when a frontier company does these hugely expensive models, these are $1 billion programs, $100 million of training, enormous resources, takes 6 months, 10,000 computers, 24 hours a day, very, very expensive, not very many of them. There's evidence that within 2 years, that ability will become available in open source form. And you sit there and you go, like, why does Eric care? If it's in open source form, it doesn't carry with it all of the safety features that the frontier model does. And we don't today know how to solve that problem. So we've got a future national security problem, or a terrorist problem, or an Osama bin Laden problem, where you've got some truly evil human being who could have access to this source code and do seriously bad things, whether it's cyber attacks, biological attacks, what have you. We have to have this conversation, and I wanted to say this to this group directly. This is a conversation that has to happen this year, because it's going to happen in a year or two at the rate things are going.
So Geoffrey Hinton, who I suspect you know, a Google executive, resigned his job because he thought this new artificial intelligence form was an existential threat. That was the phrase he used. Are you that worried about it?
I am, in the scenario that I described. So Jeff is a brilliant inventor of these technologies. He founded a small company that we at Google, when I was chairman, purchased. So I know him very well. He's an incredible human being. He is now looking at his legacy and saying, I didn't quite realize what could happen with the math that I did 20 years ago. And I understand that. It's not up to him anymore, he's left, but it's up to us to make sure his concerns are not realized, at least at full. There was a study, I think in October of last year, where more than 50% of computer scientists, God knows if we are correct on these things or not, when asked, said that there was a 10% or more danger of this technology creating an extinction event for humanity. So whether that number is 10% or 2%, whatever, it's too high. It needs to be zero. And the way you get to zero is you recognize scalable misuse. I'm not talking about harm to a specific individual, which of course is horrific. I'm not obviously endorsing that.
Oh, Eric, I think you froze on us. Isn't it ironic that we're talking about technology and then technology isn't working for us? Let's see if they manage. Oh, here you are. You're back.
Yeah, it's cut out. I'm sorry.
You need better internet service.
Can you hear me? This technology can be used to harm millions of people in biology, millions of people in cyber, and this is just not good. We have to come up with a regulatory structure which we are comfortable. And this is not unlike the 1975 Asilomar Conference or the 1951 RAND study around nuclear. When these technologies emerged in the past, the scientists got together with the government in a series of meetings. So for example, in 1975 Asilomar, they decided to put limits on recombinant DNA use on the human, essentially genome, and in particular the line of inheritance. And that was a very wise decision from way back.
But do you think that China, for instance, who obviously is working in this same area, is going to sign on to that kind of a conference or any regulatory regime which might be created?
So the thinking in the U.S. anyway, which at the moment, let me just opine and be obnoxious, and I apologize for saying this again, but the fact of the matter is the leadership is occurring in the U.S. and it's occurring in the U.S. West Coast. It's not occurring in China for the reasons that I described earlier. It's not occurring in India, although it should. It's not occurring in Japan, although it should. And in Europe, your regulatory structure is screwing you up. And I've said this before. It's preventing progress. I've been working hard in Europe to try to get some of these companies started because I want a European player, and I can think of a lot of reasons to have Europe be a player. But the fact of the matter is, at the moment, these are U.S. is leading, and the U.S. has a responsibility to define a proper regulatory structure that allows us to get the benefit of this technology without the problems that we're identifying. There's been a series of meetings, including a recent White House meeting. The current thinking is to spend the summer, and we'll see if this is true or not, spend the summer talking about this and come up with a set of sort of guidelines that the government and the industry would sort of be comfortable with, would address these concerns. I'm part of some of those conversations. There are many such conversations. I'm optimistic we'll come to that. If we manage to collectively get our act together, including, let's use as an example, the G7 countries, or some form of Brussels consensus, as well as Japan, Korea, and so forth, then I think we're going to be in a strong position to have a nice chat with China. I think that's the order. China doesn't want an extinction event either, so I'm sure that there will be a conversation that's a meaningful conversation at some point, and my guess would be over the next year.
We do have some audience questions, but quickly before we get to those, this is a summit of democracies. What is the impact of this technology on democracy?
Well, part of the reason I said at the beginning that democracies are so important because I think they're incredibly imperiled by this technology. And the reason has to do with misinformation. You, as a human being, as you're born, are taught to believe and hear what you see. Basically, what you see and hear is what you think, right? It's easy. It's true of babies, right? And so we've now got a situation where what you see and hear is probably not true in a political context. It's probably been amplified, boosted, modified. That's a real threat to democracy. I wrote a piece last week with Jonathan Haidt in the U.S. in the Atlantic, which called for a set of reforms around social media, which include knowing who's on the platform, knowing where the content came from, things like this. So there are some techniques, but I think that let me say it more bluntly. When I spend lots of time with politicians, I want to talk about AI. They want to talk about social media. The AI is the future, the social media is the present, and social media is driving them crazy, not because they don't want people talking, but because the platforms boost crazy people. China has solved this problem by not allowing it, okay? And I'm not suggesting we don't allow it, but if we can't get the social media impact on democracy under some level of control that we're comfortable with, the AI system makes it much, much worse because of targeting and misinformation. And that is my primary concern for you all. It's an alliance of democracies. We care a lot about democracy. It's at threat.
Which leads me to an audience question here. Can AI make better decisions than voters?
So the way AI works is it works against an objective function. And the problem with the question that was posed was, I don't know what the objective function is. And an AI system can as easily elect a saint as a sinner based on how you train it. So at the moment, the answer is highly unlikely. AI can be used to make things more transparent. You can also use AI to detect lies, right, which would be useful. But at the same time, it also empowers manipulation of images and content in a way. And we're going to have a very serious set of examples, I think, in the next election cycles in Europe and in the US, because I still think we're not ready for this. People are working on it. We're not ready.
The Pope in a puffer jacket was just the beginning.
But funny, by the way, I was in the Vatican with the Pope the day that thing was circulated, and the real Pope is bent over like this, right? He's an elderly man, an amazing man, but an elderly man, and the Pope in the puffer jacket is straight and handsome and so forth and so on. So that's a good example where the visual inspection, you can clearly see it's a fake, but how many people didn't know that?
I want to try and squeeze in one more question here. How can we counter the Chinese practice of founding companies in the US and EU, and through such cover-up entities participate in tech standardization with the aim to harvest IP and innovation? This is a threat to the US-EU leadership in, for instance, the advanced chip development. Your thoughts?
All of that is true. The Chinese are very intelligent. So they have taken all the standards bodies and they've packed them with more of their people than our people. If you take a look at 5GPP, which is the 5G standard, it's now largely controlled, I think, by the Chinese standards bodies. So they have a coherent, thoughtful strategy for each of these industries, and what you're describing is one of them. I am not in favor of getting rid of all the Chinese nationals. And I want to be very clear why. We did an analysis of the top papers in science, and most of them are coming out of the West, but most of them have 1 or 2 Chinese-born authors. So I'd much rather take the position of, I'll take the risk of the intellectual property transfer that you're describing in return for getting the best brains out of China into the West and keeping them there. If you look at quantum, for example, we trained a quantum scientist who went back to China to start their program. That was terrible. So I'd rather have an inclusive strategy where we manage the examples, the stealing examples, and those are criminal and stop it and so forth, but I don't want to break the link. I think it's too valuable. I want the Chinese working with us, not against us.
Dr. Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google and founder of the Special Competitive Studies Project. Thanks so much for joining us. Great conversation.